Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be talking about the rest of the books that I read in 2019. Remember when I said I was going to do recent reads videos so that I wouldn't have to talk about too many books in one video? Yeah, so I kind of fell behind in making recent reads videos, so now I have to talk about every single book that I read between June and now. I guess I don't have to talk about it, but I feel like I really wanted to share my thoughts about a lot of these books and I didn't know what other format I could do. For the sake of time, I'm not going to be talking about any books that I have mentioned in previous videos. So that includes books that were in my Reading Rush vlog. When I reread Percy Jackson, I made a video about that. And I also did a single review for We Hunt the Flame by Hepzibah Faisal. So if you want to hear my thoughts about those books, please check those videos out. The way I'm structuring this video is going to be by genre. So I'm going to start with all the contemporary I read, then all the sci-fi fantasy, and then the other books that I couldn't fit into one single genre. This both helps me mentally prepare for the video, as well as probably makes it easier for you if you tend to like a certain genre more than something else. At least I hope it benefits you. If it doesn't, then I'm sorry. So without further ado, let's begin, because I think it's going to be a long one. So the first book I'm going to talk about is More Than We Can Tell by Brigid Kemmerer. This is a companion novel to Letters to the Lost, which I read earlier in 2019, and I absolutely loved that book. And this follows one of the characters that we meet in that book and explores more of his personal story, as well as exploring a new character. So we follow Rev, who is in Letters to the Lost, and at the beginning of this novel, he begins receiving letters from his abusive biological father. So his story kind of revolves around coping with and unraveling that past trauma. And then the other perspective is Emma, who is really into coding and gaming, so much so to the fact that she designs her own video game that is fairly popular around her community. She struggles with having this passion for coding and not having her mother support that, as well as being the target of online harassment. Rev and Emma end up meeting at a time where they're both kind of in a dark place, and they find a lot of support and companionship within each other. So before I begin, definitely there are trigger warnings for child abuse, harassment, and attempted assault in this book. So I had a lot of expectations going into this novel because I truly really loved Letters to the Lost, and I have to say I was slightly disappointed in this companion novel. Brigid Kemmerer tends to handle a lot of hard-hitting topics, and I don't think she explored them as well in this novel. I thought Rev's perspective was really valuable in this book. It really talked about the cycle of abuse and Rev's fear of eventually contributing to that cycle, but also explores a lot of the really supportive relationships that he has with other people, like his adoptive parents, who are so loving, as well as his best friend Declan. Their friendship in Letters to the Lost was so good, and it is just as good in this novel. I love seeing such a positive representation for boys just being honest and supportive of each other. I do almost feel like Brigid Kemmerer tried to tackle too many topics in this book. For example, with Rev's storyline, Rev's parents are foster parents and they end up taking in this kid named Michael. And in the beginning, Michael is very isolated and secluded and almost has an animosity towards people around him. And the book tries to explore kind of unraveling why he is the way he is and exploring the relationship he forms with Rev. But I wish there was just more of it because I feel like it was kind of left without a conclusion. It definitely hinted at some sort of positive ending, but I really wish we got to see that because I think that would have added a lot of nuance to the discussion, or at least a different perspective than from Rev in terms of being adopted. Most of the flaws I had with this novel did come from Emma's storyline. I was really excited to read about her because as someone who did like coding in high school and loved seeing women in STEM, I was really excited to read about someone in a YA novel. But it was really hard for me to support Emma in her struggle with her mom. Like I said, her mom doesn't really support her. Her mom's a doctor, so she kind of would prefer her daughter to go into something more traditional, I guess. But the way the narrative played out, Emma was almost unjustifiably angry at the people around her, including her best friend who was only trying to be supportive. Even her mom, who is the source of Emma's anger, does try her best to reach out, and Emma is just so close-minded about receiving that. And I understand that's a very human response and probably a very normal response for teenagers. I definitely relate to that. But I don't think there was enough discussion about how Emma's behavior herself was harmful. It is addressed, but I wish there was more of a kind of personal journey in her realizing that it's not just the people around her's fault for misunderstanding her. I did like that we get to explore the hostile environment that Emma enters when she does go into that predominantly male space that is the video game community. The pacing of that storyline, though, kind of contradicted with what the rest of the novel set out to be. The last, third of this novel, I would say, almost read like a thriller. And I'm not gonna lie that focusing more on that fast-paced plot was engaging and hooked me into the story. But I think it came at a cost to really exploring more about the characters, which I personally love more about Bridget Kemmer's stories. So overall, I gave this 3 stars. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Lines We Cross by Randa Abdel Fattah. This is also a dual perspective novel. We follow Mina, who is a Muslim refugee from Afghanistan who moves to Australia when she's a kid, and we also follow Michael, who is a white boy living in Australia, whose parents are the leaders of this xenophobic white supremacist organization. Mina ends up moving to Michael's school, and when they meet each other, they are instantly attracted to each other. But Michael kind of has to reconcile what he has been taught all his life with what he sees in Mina. And Mina also has a personal journey to go on with coping with a lot of her past trauma as a refugee. So first off, I want to say that I loved Mina as a character. She was so independent and strong-willed. And given all the experiences that she's had and also just the pettiness of high school that she has to deal with, she handles everything so maturely and so well, and I love that about her. I also loved her relationship with Michael. I didn't really know what to expect going into this novel because with a lot of the popularized stories about Muslim girls, a lot of them have to do with Muslim girls leaving their culture and religion and falling in love with a white boy. But the way the romance developed in this book was done so well. Because like I said before, Michael was instantly attracted to Mina, and for a lot of it, he was just kind of considering her an exception to his parents' beliefs. And Mina wouldn't have that. Whenever he thought that he was doing enough, Michael actually had to change and unlearn the beliefs that he had all this time. And I thought that was done really organically and really well. It kind of reminded me of Pride and Prejudice, honestly. This is not a retelling, it just reminded me of it. In the sense that both parties really had to learn to understand the other person and change for the better before their romantic relationship began. This is kind of small, but I also noticed that this book kind of accurately portrays what high school friendships are like, at least from my experience. I like the fact that you follow like a group of people, and it's not just like they have one token best friend, because for a lot of people that's not the case. What kind of brought my opinion a little down about this novel was the way it ended. Everything that happened I thought made sense. I just thought that how quickly it happened didn't make sense. I don't know if this is a spoiler, but if you don't really want to know anything about the end of the novel, then I wouldn't listen. But essentially Michael does something kind of big that is in disagreement with his family, and it kind of resolves pretty quickly. They're just like, yeah, families have different political views all the time. And given that his family was the leader of a white supremacist organization, I just didn't think that it would like play off that easily. I kind of wanted to see them argue about it. Also, I kind of had a problem with the very last sentence of this book, which was like probably very nitpicky, but I don't know. Essentially, Mina says that the lesson that she learned through this whole experience was that she should never give up on anybody. And I don't really agree with that, because I don't think anyone necessarily has to give everyone a chance. I think the message should be more along the lines of that people can change. Like a lot of times you are convinced that these people who uphold really bigoted values can never change, but Michael shows that it's possible. Even though I had a little bit of those issues, I still highly recommend this novel, and overall I gave it 4 stars. The next book I'll talk about is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is about an Afro-Latinx girl named Imani Santiago who in her freshman year of high school gets pregnant, and we follow her in her senior year of high school as she lives as a teen mom and tries to balance that life with her school. She's entering the college application season, and she's trying to figure out what she wants to do with her life, if she wants to go the more traditional route of college or pursue what her actual dream is, and that's to be a chef. The struggle is kind of highlighted when her school starts offering a culinary arts class that'll end with an apprenticeship in Spain that'll give her the opportunity to work with professional chefs. I really enjoyed this novel. Like, a word I would describe it as it's just lovely. Elizabeth Acevedo is the author of The Poet X, which I read earlier in 2019, and I absolutely adored that. And while that book is written in verse, this one is written in prose. But there's still a sort of lyrical cadence to the writing that is able to invoke so much emotion and so much power that I absolutely love about the writing. What I also notice about Elizabeth Acevedo is that she tries to infuse the passion that her protagonists have into the writing itself. So like in The Poet X, the main character is a slam poet, and the entire novel is written in verse. And with this one, our main character is obsessed with cooking and has such a passion about food, and throughout the book we get the recipes that she actually makes in the book, which I thought was really creative and helped you get into the atmosphere of the book and into the mind of the character. We also get to learn a little bit about Imani's heritage, as her father is from Puerto Rico and is currently living in Puerto Rico. Right off the bat, what I really appreciate about the story is that it does talk about a teen mom, which is a perspective we don't really get to see much in young adult fiction, at least I don't think. And I absolutely loved Imani's character. She was so mature for her age. Like, obviously she had to learn to balance a lot of things as she is caring for a child. And like, figuring out what you want to do with your life is hard enough, but having to take into account so many different aspects, it was really admirable to see her go through that and be so thoughtful in her decisions. There is a romance in this book with a new boy in her school named Malachi, who is a Black Muslim, which is also an identity we don't get to see very much in YA. And that relationship was so sweet. And also, I think because Imani had gone through that previous relationship with the guy who was the father of her child, she entered this one again with such a mature attitude. But it was also really good to see her kind of let loose and allow herself to have something that she enjoys and is just for herself. I really like the whole message of this novel because it shows that just because your dreams are not traditional doesn't mean they're not important, they're not worth pursuing. I gave this book 4 stars. It's just a good slice of life novel that makes you feel really good at the end of it. The other 2 contemporary books I read this summer were Perks of Being a Wallflower and Radio Silence, but I did talk about both of those in my Reading Rush vlog, so that's where my thoughts will be. Now we're going to start talking about the sci-fi and fantasy section. And the first book that I'm going to talk about is The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. Honestly, explaining this series is kind of hard. It's a little wacky. So it follows a girl named Blue Sargent who comes from a family of psychics, but she herself is not a psychic. And one day she follows her mom on this routine to go to a graveyard and see the souls, the people who are going to die that year. And as someone who is not a psychic, she shouldn't be able to see anyone, but she ends up seeing a boy named Gansey. Fast forward a couple of days, and at work she bumps into this group of boys from Aglamby Academy who are known as the Raven Boys. And this group of boys has Ronan, Adam, Noah, and Gansey. Gansey has kind of had this goal for most of his life to find this dead Welsh prince. And Blue kind of gets caught up in that search along with the rest of these boys. The Raven Cycle has honestly become one of my favorite series of all time now, which is a pretty big thing to say. And when I started reading it, I didn't think it would be actually, because in the beginning I was pretty apathetic towards most things about the book. I was just kind of like cruising along. Honestly, some of the characters kind of annoyed me, like Ronan needed to calm down and Gansey was kind of pretentious. But I don't know what happened along the way. But by the end of the book, I was so deeply attached to these characters. The found family aspect of this series is just so heartwarming, like especially among the 4 boys. And what I like is that we don't just get to see everything going right between everyone. We see a lot of growing pains, a lot of insecurities coming out, a lot of lashing out on each other. But all those conflicts ultimately resolve in a way that makes all of their bonds so much stronger. And like, that's just beautiful. Like, truly, I was moved to tears at some of their storylines. I loved Blue and Gansey's relationship. Like, it is so extremely subtle, and it's just made up of these such small moments, but they're so impactful. And same with Adam and Ronan, it's just these small moments. And that's just, I think, a testament to Maggie Stiefvater's writing. I also love the world building in this series, which might not be everyone's cup of tea. It's pretty low fantasy, like it almost reads more contemporary than it does read fantasy, even though there are those fantastical elements of it. But I think it honestly captures what it would be like if someone were to just stumble upon magic. Like, there wasn't any portal to another world, there wasn't any sage character to teach you, like these kids are just figuring it out as they go along. And because we learn about the magic through these characters figuring out themselves, the world building is very subtle and it adds on each book. I think if you're a fan of more hard magic systems that have a set of rules that you can really understand why things happen, you're probably not going to enjoy this series, but I personally thought that the way Maggie Stiefvater went about the world building was very purposeful and added so much to the ambiance and the atmosphere. A common critique that you've probably heard about the Raven Cycle is that there's no plot, and I wouldn't necessarily say that there's no plot. I just think that the plot isn't what you're reading for. You're reading to explore these characters. But personally, I think the plot is pretty interesting too. Like, it almost reads as a subtle mystery novel. I mean, I haven't read many mysteries, but that's what I get the feeling of. And the ending of each book always had a really interesting climax, and so I was hooked by it. I gave the first 2, The Raven Boys and the Dream Thieves, 4 stars, and I gave the 3rd and 4th ones, Lily Lily Blue and The Raven King, 5 stars. The next 2 books that I have, I don't physically own, and they are Wires of Nerve and Gone Rogue by Marissa Meyer. This is a sequel graphic novel series to the Lunar Chronicles, so if you haven't read the Lunar Chronicles, you might not want to hear what I have to say if you do intend on reading the Lunar Chronicles, which I highly recommend. And this series follows Aiko and her new humanoid android body. Definitely the strongest point of both of these books is Aiko's character, because Aiko is an android, but she's a very highly intelligent, highly conscious android, so she doesn't really fit into the description of human or robot. And she faces a lot of judgment because of that, because a lot of people can't see past the fact that she's a robot and won't give her the opportunity or the chance to prove herself. And I just like the fact that we got to more deeply explore this character that was in all the previous novels in the series, but was always just pushed to the side as a companion. I also just really loved being back in the world of these characters and seeing them all again and seeing them together again. Like, that was so much fun. While the plot of the story is very entertaining, it was kind of weak, especially with the antagonist storyline. Essentially what happens is that after the events of the Lunar Chronicles, a lot of these bioengineered mutants are retaliating against the system because they want revenge for what happened to them and what Levana did to them, which I think is a pretty valid storyline to pursue, but I don't think it was executed that well, especially in the second volume. Like, essentially the villain's entire motive is to try to get this cure from Cinder, but Cinder keeps repeatedly saying that there is no cure, it just does not exist. And that just made the villain's plot kind of meaningless. That's a strong word, but it wasn't that compelling. There's a lot of good action, a lot of good character interactions between these faves that I loved. This is probably not this story's fault, but I just don't think I like graphic novels very much as a storytelling format. And it's definitely just me, but I find myself that I can't really get immersed in the story. The fact that everything is divided into panels just makes it so choppy in my mind. And this is definitely a me problem. And it was especially apparent for me reading this story because these are definitely characters that I already know from reading them in the novel form, but I still felt like a little bit distant from them. Overall, I did have a good time with them and I gave them both 3.5 stars. The next book I read was for the Paper Cut Book Club, and that is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. This follows a princess named Ani who, from her infancy, was being trained to be queen of her kingdom. But Ani kind of didn't really suit the role as queen. She wasn't very good at speaking to people. She wasn't very good at being proper. Her talent was actually talking to birds. One day, when she's a lot older, she finds out that her mom has traded her off in a political marriage to a far-off kingdom. On the way to that kingdom, her lady-in-waiting orchestrates a mutiny that forces her to run away. In order to survive, she takes on a job as a goose girl for the castle, all the while trying to think of a plan to convince the kingdom that the girl that they received is not the actual princess. I hope I explained that okay. It's kind of a weird plot. I ended up really adoring this book. Like, it really is my cup of tea. It is a fairy tale retelling. It has this kind of enchanting atmosphere. It's just everything that I like. I really like the fact that Ani goes through a huge character journey in this book, and you really get to see her explore who she is and what she wants to be and figure out what her talents are. I also love all the friendships that she makes, especially when she works as the Goose Girl. As you can tell, I really like it when books have nice friendships. But also, it was really well paced and the action scenes were really, really exciting. Now that I think about it, this would make a fantastic animated movie. I have to shout out the audiobook for this one because it is by far the best audiobook that I've ever listened to. So first off, it has a full cast, but it also has music. Now, for so long, ever since I discovered audiobooks, I always wished that audiobooks could have a music score that kind of like how movies have a music score. But obviously I knew that was kind of impractical because audiobooks are very, very long. But this audiobook has music in it. Admittedly, it's not the entire audiobook, but at the end of every chapter and during very intense scenes, there is background music to supplement it, which I thought was so cool and made the reading experience so much fun. There were definitely parts of the plot that I thought were a little predictable, but it's kind of predictable in the sense that a Disney princess movie or just a Disney movie in general is predictable, but like a good Disney movie. And there were some interesting twists in there that I didn't see coming. This is probably a 4.5 star read, but I rated it up to 5 just because I did have just a genuinely good time reading it, which probably had to do with the audiobook. I definitely want to read more books in this series, and I think it's more of a companion novel sort of thing, so I'll definitely check that out soon. And now, transitioning from that really nice read, we have my least favorite book of the year. And that is Volume 1 of The Boys by Garth Ennis. So this series essentially takes place in a world where superheroes are pretty much the bad guys, like they abuse their power and their fame. And so we follow a group called The Boys, who are a CIA-backed organization that takes down bad superheroes, I guess you could say. I had to read this for a class, but based on that synopsis, I would probably have been interested in reading it. I liked the idea of subverting the superhero genre and introducing a different perspective, which is honestly probably a more realistic perspective of what would happen if we did have superheroes in our world. But this was just not good. There's just a needless overuse of provocative scenes that are from the male gaze. So many passing misogynistic and homophobic jokes. And probably the worst part is that there's so much sexual assault. Now obviously sexual assault is an important topic to shed light on, but the way this series used it was solely for the motivation of the male characters. I think one storyline had the bare bones to be okay. It was about a new girl superhero being inducted into this superhero society, I guess. People that she has looked up to all her life, and she ends up becoming the victim of sexual assault by them, which is a way for her to realize that her heroes are bad. I did only read volume 1, so I didn't really get much of what happens with the plot later on. I do know that it's a television show, I think on Prime, that I heard is better than the comics, but still kind of a little weird. It's just, there's a difference between having something in order to shed light on it and using it just for shock value. I don't think I've ever given something 1 star, but truly I was like abhorred reading this book. Now that I got that out of the way, I'm going to talk about The Toll by Neal Shusterman. This is the final book in the Arc of a Scythe series by Neal Shusterman that takes place in a world that has defeated death and is run by this artificial intelligence unit called the Thunderhead. The only issue that really remains in this world is population control, and because they didn't want an artificial intelligence controlling death and life, they instituted this thing called Scythes, who are given the ability to glean people, and if you are gleaned, you cannot be revived. The main characters of the first book, Rowan and Citra, are training to be apprentices for Scythe Faraday. And as they learn more and more about the Scythedom and how to be an honorable Scythe, they realize that the Scythedom is kind of turning in a direction that is highly corrupt. That's all that I can pretty much say about this series. Actually, before I talk about this one, I'll talk about Scythe and Thunderhead, because I did actually reread these after I read this one. I'm not gonna hold these are heavy. So I took a class this semester called The Problem of Evil in Popular Culture, and our final paper, we could write it about anything that we wanted in popular culture. And seeing as The Toll was coming out in October, I figured that I would just write it on the Scythe trilogy. But when I finished The Toll and I went to start writing the essay, I realized I forgot a lot about the first 2 books, and I needed to also find quotes for the essay, so I ended up just rereading it. I won't explain too much. I love both of these books. I think I gave the first one 4.5 stars and I gave Thunderhead 5 stars. This is truly one of the most interesting dystopian worlds that I've ever read, and that was definitely my favorite part of the experience reading it. And I know my least favorite experience reading the first 2 back when I read them in 2018 was the romance between Citra and Rowan, but reading it again, I didn't mind it actually. Perhaps it's because I went in knowing what happens to them later on, or just knowing that it's a thing to begin with, but I actually kind of liked it. It's definitely not the strong suit of this series, nor is it a focus, but I don't think that it detracted from the experience reading it in any way, at least the second time around. I really enjoy Shusterman's writing style, or I guess with the format of the book. Between each chapter, there is some sort of supplementary information, or I guess not supplementary, like it's necessary for the story, but it's not like written in the narrative itself, like it is from a journal, from a Scythe, or the Thunderhead's thoughts, or an official document sent in that world. And I thought that was just a brilliant way to build the world, and such an organic way to build the world. Like, I was always so compelled when reading those parts. Especially in Thunderhead, like, the Thunderhead is probably my favorite part of this entire series. I love it so much, and I love the questions that we get to explore about humanity and being human. Even in the third book, The Toll, we still get more added to the world building through those little vignettes in between. So I guess back to the last book. So in The Toll, obviously we continue following the story of the characters in the previous novels, but we also get introduced to a surprisingly large amount of new characters. And most of the time that would probably end up not working too well because they probably wouldn't have the time to develop. But Neal Shusterman is so efficient and so good at characterizing the people in his books. And I realize I really like that kind of use of storytelling when we don't get to see just our limited group of characters. Like, even if we just visit a character for a small perspective, that perspective adds so much to the overall story. Some of the main characters from the previous novels do kind of take a little bit of a backseat in this book, which I have seen people criticize about it or just not enjoy about the book. But personally, I didn't mind it because everything felt necessary and purposeful, like I said before, and there was enough of each character for me to feel satisfied. The plot was action-packed and the ending took a turn that I really didn't expect. But after rereading Scythe and Thunderhead, I really should have expected it because there were a lot of clues, but truly I just did not see it coming and I was so floored. The most emotional part of this book was definitely Grayson and Thunderhead's relationship, and I don't want to say too much about it, but truly it brought me to tears at times. So yes, 5 stars, really loved it. So now we're on to whatever's left. So the first one of these I'm going to talk about is Becoming by Michelle Obama, which I actually started back in February and I got about halfway through, but I finally finished it in June. This is a memoir about Michelle Obama's life starting from when she was a kid up until the 2016 election and a little bit after that, I think, too. So overall, I would definitely say that I really enjoyed this story. I thought Michelle Obama had so many words of wisdoms and quotes that I still look at today that I found so impactful for me. I did find that I was starting to get a little bit disinterested when I got to the second part. So the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is her as a child, going to high school and going to college. The second part is her job as a lawyer and meeting Barack Obama. And then the third part is during Barack Obama's presidency and her time as a first lady. And perhaps it's just because I am not a full-grown adult, I don't have a full-time job, I'm not married, that a lot of the things that she was talking about in the second section I couldn't really resonate with as much, and so I wasn't as invested. But I still think it was pretty valuable experiences to share that I'm sure one day I'll definitely resonate more with. I really loved seeing her perspective, talking about the education as she was growing up and how there were a lot of hurdles that she as a Black woman faced that her white counterparts didn't have to face. Like, she even talks about at one point that her guidance counselor told her not to apply to Princeton because it wasn't for girls like her, and how throughout her life she continued to reject what was expected of her and form her own path. I mean, that is the basis behind the title of the novel, Becoming. It is her journey of becoming who she is, and that is not a journey that ends, really. I also found it pretty interesting to read about the third part because that was during a time where I was alive, but I was also really young during Obama's first term, so I don't actually know a lot about what was happening politically. And I didn't know how much work Michelle Obama did. Honestly, I just feel like I gained a lot from reading the book in terms of knowledge, in terms of perspective. I gave this 4 stars on Goodreads, but I feel like it's kind of mean because I feel like I shouldn't rate someone's personal story. But I don't know, I rate based on enjoyment, so. So the next 2 books I read were A Study in Charlotte and Last of August by Brittany Cavallaro. These are the first 2 books in the Charlotte Holmes series, is that what it's called? This essentially takes place in a world where Sherlock and Watson were real people and we're following their descendants, Charlotte Holmes and Jamie Watson. They both end up at the same boarding school and end up involved in solving this mystery having to do with the murder at that school. I guess I could have put this in contemporary, but it is technically a mystery, so I had a lot of fun with this book, and I think it had primarily to do with the 2 main characters, Jamie Watson and Charlotte Holmes. Charlotte was such an interesting character because she was so invested in her craft, in her knowledge, and so skilled as well. But she wasn't really that good with people, and Jamie, on the other hand, was just kind of like following around. This was surprisingly a lot darker than I expected. There is mention of sexual assault, it's not depicted, but it is mentioned. And they also explore a little bit about addiction in this book. And I just thought I was heading into like a fun mystery novel, but it got a little bit darker than I expected. But I was kind of here for it. As someone who doesn't read a lot of mystery novels, I did really enjoy the mystery aspect of this book. But I think what really had me hooked onto the story was the relationship between Jamie and Charlotte. I love their dynamic together, and it's pretty slow burn, which is my preference. I think they both functioned and made the other person better in a way, which I really enjoyed seeing. So yeah, this installment I gave 4 stars. The sequel, I don't actually own it yet. I didn't enjoy quite as much. There was a lot of angst in the romance department, and I actually don't mind angst. But I think the first book had a better balance of the dynamic between the two main characters and the plot going on. The plot in this book was kind of wishy-washy, and a lot of developments were happening without proper foundations. And because we spent a lot more time on the characters and their just emotions, it was a little bit jarring when the end kind of flip-flopped and was totally based on plot and was really fast-paced. So I ended up giving The Last of August 3 stars. So the last two books I'm going to talk about are The Handmaid's Tale and The Testaments, both by Margaret Atwood. I read these both for that same Problem of Evil class. Honestly, I'm not going to say too much. I feel like I don't have much to add in the sense of analysis. I don't think I actually got the full perspective in terms of analysis because we mostly just talked about its role in popular culture and what it says about how we view evil. Not necessarily say like the literary aspects of it that might be like appealing to critics and stuff, which may have possibly made my opinion higher in retrospect, but just purely on enjoyment, I thought The Handmaid's Tale was fine. It was immensely slow up until maybe like halfway, and I tried both the audiobook and the physical book, and both were still kind of hard to get through. The protagonist was very passive, and I think it totally makes sense given the world that Margaret Atwood is talking about and what she created, but it doesn't mean that I wasn't still kind of frustrated with it. This book is obviously very important in terms of its messages about control of the female body and control of reproductive rights, and the potential of a society that has progressed so much to regress at the same rate. So I ended up giving it 3 stars because of that. The Testaments is a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, which came out this year, which was highly anticipated by a lot of people who wanted to know more about The Handmaid's Tale because it does kind of leave off a little bit open-endedly. And I have to say that I enjoyed The Testaments a lot more than The Handmaid's Tale. And it's so strange because Margaret Atwood wrote both, but it feels like it was written by a completely different person. We follow 3 perspectives. One is a teen in the US, one is a teen in Canada that is watching along the sidelines of what's happening in the US. And we follow Aunt Lydia, who is in The Handmaid's Tale, and aunts are essentially women who are enforcers of the regime. Maybe it's because 2 of the protagonists were teens, but this actually read a lot more like YA. Actually, it probably has more to do with the fact that this is a lot more plot focused. Like there's this constant motion that is keeping you going forward that honestly I found a little bit addicting. But it's also really strange because the book is very predictable. Because like the big twists that you're leading up to, honestly you could have figured out from the beginning. But I can't deny that I had a good time reading it. Like I was invested. I also don't know if the Testaments said anything new regarding the issues at hand about reproductive rights and women being in control of themselves that The Handmaid's Tale didn't already say. I forgot to mention that it does take place like 15 years after The Handmaid's Tale, but perhaps that could also mean that this story still needs to be told, like since it is 15 years in the future and 30 years in the future in real time, how this kind of story still needs to be told, and told in a way that is probably more accessible to people and more enjoyed by people, so that the average reader wouldn't be turned away from kind of like dense, boring writing. I don't know Margaret Atwood's mind, but that's what I'm kind of leaning towards. So The Testaments is supposed to take into account what has happened in the Handmaid's Tale TV show. I haven't seen the TV show, so I don't know anything beyond the first season when they start going past the book. But in my class, we did discuss that there were some implications of things that happened in this book that kind of don't work as well when you consider what has happened in the TV show. So that might be something you want to bear in mind if you do enjoy the TV show and want to check out the book. So yeah, I ended up giving The Testaments 4 stars. I'm finally done. So those are all the rest of the books that I read in 2019. Thank you so much for watching. If you stuck all the way through, please let me know your thoughts about some of these books if you've read them. I hope you have a wonderful new year, and I'll see you later. Bye.